Borderlands 4 is one of the worst examples of game optimization that we've seen in some time. It's not a bad looking game by any means, it's just far too taxing for the visuals and overall experience that it provides. And for some reason, the developer's CEO, Randy Pitchford, thinks this problem is your fault. You, the gamer, trying to enjoy Borderlands 4. He reckons the game is actually quite optimal, insinuating that us PC gamers are just a bunch of losers with garbage hardware. Mr. Pitchford should probably just stop talking at this point and let the community fix the mess if he's not going to. Today I'll be trying to help you improve Borderlands 4 performance through a set of sensible settings tweaks. And no, I'm not just suggesting you enable frame generation and call it a day. We'll be exploring every setting in the game and how it affects both visuals and performance to give you a set of optimal settings that might be worth using. Normally we call these optimization guides, but I honestly don't think setting tweaks are enough to get this game into an optimized state. This is more of a get things running a little faster and hope for the best guide. Few quick notes about test systems before getting into everything. All visual comparisons were captured at 4K using the NVIDIA GeForce RTX 5090 with DLSS quality enabled. I would strongly recommend watching this video using YouTube's 4K mode for the highest bitrate. Performance testing was performed primarily on an RTX 5060 Ti 16GB at 1440p with DLSS quality. The CPU used is the AMD Ryzen 7 9800X3D with 32GB of memory.
Today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Ugreen and their MagFlow 2-in-1 wireless charger, featuring new and improved Qi 2 wireless charging. For a world first, Ugreen are boasting wireless charging performance with 25 watt of efficient uninterrupted power delivery, and that's a significant improvement over the previous 15 watts. The MagFlow integrates Apple's MagSafe magnetic alignment concept to improve charging efficiency and safety, while still maintaining compatibility with Android and other wireless charging capable devices. It also supports USB-C charging at 5 watts, which can be used in conjunction with the 2 wireless pads for a total of 35 watts of charging power. Ugreen has also released a 10,000 mAh power bank, which works the same way, but rather than a vertical phone charger, it supports an integrated USB-C cable. These units are compact, making them the perfect travel companion, or great options for a minimalistic desktop. If you'd like to learn more about the Ugreen MagFlow lineup, please check the link in the video description.
The first of the main settings is HLOD loading range. I thought this setting might have a broader impact on draw distance and the point at which objects pop in, but it doesn't seem to affect at least the most obvious forms of pop-in when moving around. Instead, it only seems to affect the loading of super distant objects. Occasionally you can see this setting not loading some objects when set to near instead of far, but this can be difficult to spot among the fog that is widely used throughout. In my benchmark pass, I found a 1% performance improvement using either the medium or near settings, and I found it difficult to spot any difference between medium and far, so you may as well bank the small gain and use medium. Geometry quality controls the draw distance at which dynamic objects are rendered. Trees, for example, have 2 models that can be loaded in: a dynamic animated model that blows slightly in the wind, or a fully static model with no movement. High geometry quality settings allow more distant objects to be animated, and this creates a more alive world. I didn't see much impact lowering this setting when it comes to average frame rate. However, there was up to a 4% improvement using the low setting when looking at 1% low performance. Depending on the environment, lowering these settings can be noticeable, so I'd largely stick to high unless you desperately need more performance. Texture quality is quite an interesting setting in that it doesn't work conventionally. In a lot of other games, lowering the texture setting produces a universal reduction in texture resolution across the entire game world. Going from the maximum to minimum setting often results in blurry textures for every object on screen. With Borderlands 4, that isn't the case, and for the most part texture quality, at least while stationary, is identical between very high and low. The exception to this is that the low setting does not load some secondary detail textures on certain objects, like the gun you're holding or trash on the ground, and this can make some things look a bit flat or blurry. The biggest impact is in motion though. Lower texture quality settings take longer to load the highest quality textures, as it seems the setting modifies the overall texture pool size, causing more swapping on lower settings. I found this was most noticeable when grappling to walls. The very high settings showed the best quality textures at all times, but when moving to medium there was a small delay before the best textures are loaded, and on the low setting the delay was obvious and distracting. Low was also the quickest to reduce other textures in motion, though this effect is a bit more subtle. I guess this way of operating is better than a universal reduction to texture quality on low settings, as the game tries to show the best presentation it can within the limits you give it. This is probably the only aspect of the game that is decently well optimized. The texture quality setting has no impact to FPS performance. Provided you can fit the textures in VRAM, very high and low should deliver the same frame rate. However, there can be a reasonable difference in VRAM usage between the settings. This setting has by far the most impact to VRAM and will need to be adjusted on lower VRAM cards depending on the resolution and upscaling you're using. Each setting seems to act like an offset, measured on an RTX 5090, which has more than enough VRAM for this title. Across the various resolutions tested, lowering the setting from very high to high dropped VRAM usage by around half a gigabyte. Medium was about a 1.5 gigabyte reduction, then 2.5 gigabytes for low. Based on the results from the area I tested, Borderlands 4 should be playable in most configurations on a 12GB GPU, though you'll want 16GB for 4K native gameplay. At 1440p, you should be able to get away with 10GB provided you use DLSS quality and medium textures. It's possible high will work, but 12GB would be ideal for this resolution. 8GB cards at 1440p require both low textures and other setting reductions, unfortunately. Even at 1080p using upscaling, it looks like 8GB cards will struggle on the highest texture settings. I would recommend keeping this setting on as high of a setting as your VRAM will allow, ideally very high. The texture streaming speed setting didn't seem to do much in my testing, though it could be because I'm using decent hardware. It didn't make any difference to the slow texture loading issue we saw using low textures, for example. The streaming speed setting on very high and medium had the same loading time. This setting also had no impact on performance or VRAM, so it's safe to keep on very high. Potentially you might want to turn it down if you have a slow CPU or something like that. Anisotropic filtering quality works the same in Borderlands 4 as in other games. Higher settings preserve texture detail at greater distances and sharper angles. Lower settings look blurry, and especially when you get to 2x filtering or lower, textures can look quite bad. From a performance standpoint, there's no reason to reduce this setting unless you are on exceptionally slow hardware, which probably can't run the game at all in the first place. I had to drop the setting all the way to 2x filtering to see any more than a 1% difference, and that was to 1% lows, which simply isn't worth it given the fall off in visual quality. Turning the setting off entirely can recover around 2% to the overall frame rate, but I just wouldn't recommend it. The foliage density setting is super simple. The lower the setting, the less grass and shrubs you'll see on screen. The very high and high settings look pretty similar, while medium is a small reduction in the amount of elements on screen. The settings you'll probably want to avoid are low and anything below that, as these settings reduce the amount of grass, and this makes the game look quite flat and bad, as the ground texture that replaces the grass is pretty awful. In our normal benchmark pass, this setting didn't have a huge impact on overall performance, just a 1% increase shifting to medium and then around a 3% increase to 1% lows when moving to low or very low. However, this benchmark pass didn't have a ton of foliage, so I ran a second pass in a more foliage dense area. Here shifting to medium improved FPS by 3%, while going to the crappy settings like low can recover 5% or more. For most people with decent GPUs, I'd keep this setting on very high, reducing to medium in a more performance-oriented configuration. Volumetric Fog adjusts the resolution of the fog effect throughout the game. Lower settings use a lower resolution. That's especially noticeable in motion, causing less definition in the fog as light pierces through it. Very high does look the best here with the least aliasing, but high is a pretty close approximation that most people will be able to live with. Medium and low lose a lot of the fog's definition, but never remove the effect entirely, and in some situations these settings can look very similar to very high. This is an easy setting to optimize based on the performance that we saw. Just drop it to high and increase your FPS by around 5%, with a larger improvement to 1% lows. Going below high has a small impact, but really isn't worth it given the visual reduction. Volumetric Cloud does the same thing as Volumetric Fog, except for cloud resolution. Very high and high look very similar in my opinion, but then dropping to medium and low, we start to see a larger impact to the edges of clouds with more grain in those areas. Medium is still decent though, especially as the overall cloud quality isn't great, so it's not something you'll be spending too much time looking at. High provides a 2% boost to average performance compared to very high, and we get a 3% boost using medium, so I drop the setting to medium in most configurations or even low for those that want the highest performance. This just doesn't make a huge difference to visual quality. There are two shadow quality settings. The first is simply labeled shadow quality. This controls shadows from artificial light sources such as fires and electric lights. The first three options all look very similar, with small changes to the accuracy and resolution of shadows that you probably won't notice during gameplay. Turning the setting down to low though removes the soft shadow effect and replaces it with simple sharp shadows. Sometimes the low setting can look a little bizarre, especially straight after looking at a higher setting, but this mode still does render shadows, and it isn't the worst option to use if you're hunting the biggest performance increase. For most gamers, I'd recommend medium as a starting point. Dropping to this setting as opposed to very high increases FPS by 3%, and you get that with minimal quality impact. Low should also be considered in performance-oriented configurations because it delivers a 5 to 6% performance boost. Reducing this setting also had a small VRAM benefit, up to about 0.4 GB, going from very high to low. Directional shadow quality controls shadows cast from the sun, so this impacts most of the outdoor shadows. The biggest difference you'll spot here is shadow resolution and aliasing. The lower you go, the more aliased and grainy shadows will be in motion, particularly off things like trees swaying in the wind. High and very high look pretty similar, medium is a bit more aliased, and then low is quite grainy and unpleasant. Static shadows look pretty similar across all these modes though, and the draw distance at which higher quality shadows appear is unchanged across the modes. Given the similarities between high and very high, it's pretty safe to drop this setting one notch and gain 3% more FPS. I'd also consider medium here, given we saw a 5% improvement to average performance, while the low setting is less appealing given the way it looks. Volumetric Cloud Shadows does what it says. It controls whether shadows from clouds are rendered or not. In outdoor daytime scenes, the biggest impact this has is whether you see an overcast look or not when clouds obscure the sun. With the setting enabled, the entire game world will be dimmed and shadowed appropriately as the sun passes behind clouds, but with this setting disabled, effectively the game is in perpetual sun. It's hard to say what looks best here, as of course the game looks fine in the sun, but keeping the setting enabled does make the world feel more dynamic and real. The challenge here is that the setting has a moderate performance impact. You'll see a 4 to 5% performance gain turning cloud shadows off. I personally like how the game looks with it enabled, so that's my preference, but I can also understand disabling the setting to get that extra FPS, so I have no strong recommendation here. Lighting quality is the setting in Borderlands 4 that has the largest performance impact. It controls the level of Lumen's software-based global illumination. I looked at what this setting does across a wide range of scenes, both daytime and at night, and it's one of those classic cases with global illumination where you have the choice between a different looking, maybe more accurate presentation on the higher settings and a less accurate, still great looking, but faster game on the lower settings. The differences between very high and high are quite subtle, and this largely makes very high a placebo setting that only serves to hurt performance. On the other hand, the difference between high and medium is more noticeable, especially in certain scenes that have a lot of bounce lighting. Medium seems to limit the amount of bounces, so occasionally some objects or areas are not going to be as well illuminated on medium compared to high. One example here shows the gun reflecting light coming from behind the player on high, whereas on medium, it's more in shadow. Another example showing a cave highlights how high has a brighter cave with more illumination occurring, and that's probably the more accurate sort of presentation. But then I could also show examples where it's really very difficult to notice which setting is producing the better image quality, and often each option looks close to identical. In fact, across all scenes, low and medium seem to look basically the same, with medium occasionally having better image quality. To me, this is a very simple setting adjustment. I would play Borderlands 4 using medium lighting quality and only increase to high at most if I was playing on a high-end graphics card. Medium offers a whopping 27% performance improvement compared to very high that is used with the Badass preset, and even the high mode will improve FPS by 12% for very little visual downgrade. Moving to medium will also free up about 0.4 GB of VRAM in my testing, which might be handy for those 8 GB cards. Reflections quality is a straightforward setting. The first three options, very high, high, and medium, control the resolution of software lumen reflections. Very high and high look very similar, but in a few scenes you can see an increase in grain and shimmering when using medium, which can be a little distracting at times. Low seems to switch off lumen reflections and only shows screen space reflections. In the other modes, a combination of lumen and SSR is used, but on low, you just get screen space, so at certain angles this completely removes any reflections from being shown, while at other angles you might still get decent reflection quality. Switching off lumen reflections on the low setting does improve FPS by 6%, but makes the game world look quite a bit worse, so it's not worth the trade-off unless you are desperate for performance. Medium is an okay option, but for most people I'd recommend high. Shading quality is an interesting setting in that the game claims this impacts material quality, but it seems to do multiple things. The first thing I noticed is that some surfaces gain additional details and imperfections the higher this setting is, even though higher settings have no VRAM cost. In this scene, for example, rust and corrosion details are only added on the high setting. In this other scene, if you lower the settings to low, the ground loses some of its rocky elements. When looking at water, the surface is simplified noticeably when set to low as opposed to other settings, and even in some other scenes I noticed some dynamic elements being reduced or turned to static elements when switched down to the medium or low settings. On top of this, shading quality seems to also impact some sort of ambient occlusion or self-shadowing, particularly in indoor scenes, though you can also occasionally spot this outdoors. The high setting generates additional shadows which can give the game additional depth and a more realistic look. Sometimes though, this effect can be very hard to notice, and it was really only this indoor area out of the scenes I captured where the difference was quite obvious. This is a performance-intensive setting. Lowering it to medium improves FPS by 8% on average and then 12% going down to low. Given that low can noticeably hurt some of the details in the scene, particularly on stuff like water, I feel like medium is a good compromise here for most gamers, though low is certainly viable on performance-constrained systems. Post-process quality is simple. It affects stuff like the depth of field blur that is subtly used on your gun. The higher the setting, the less aliased the effect is, and dropping it down to medium or low seems to introduce quite noticeable shimmering. In my testing, I found dropping this setting to high, which still looks pretty good, delivers a 2% performance improvement, so that's a pretty safe option in my opinion. With all of these settings analyzed, we can create our optimized settings. Relative to the badass preset, I actually recommend reducing quite a lot of settings. Some things have little to no impact on performance, like geometry quality and anisotropic filtering, so they should be left maxed out, while other settings are best dropped to medium, like lighting quality and shadow quality. For further performance improvements, we'd recommend dropping additional settings to medium and taking some of the other settings down to low. Even on slower hardware, we'd still recommend maxing out stuff like texture quality, provided that you have enough VRAM. Our hub quality settings produce performance that sits between the high and medium presets, though closer to medium, with a 60% performance improvement compared to the badass preset and a 40% performance improvement compared to very high. Meanwhile, our hub performance settings are a slightly more performant version of the medium preset, offering an 87% increase in FPS compared to badass and around a 7% increase on medium, while looking significantly better than the low preset. So how do these settings end up looking? Well, it depends on the sorts of areas we are in, but typically, in my opinion, the hub quality preset looks like a mixture of very high and high settings. It retains the full texture quality and detail of the badass preset, with no unnecessary reductions to things like anisotropic filtering, while subtly reducing the shadow, volumetrics, and lighting settings. Some of the time these reductions are difficult to spot compared to the very high preset, though the badass preset can have a bit more life, so it's not always a performance increase without compromises. As we've nerfed lighting quality down to medium, this does have an impact in some indoor scenes where lighting can look a bit different and potentially less realistic. I don't think the game looks bad with the hub quality settings in these situations. It's still a decent looking title, but we had to compromise something. Those with higher end GPUs might like to turn back up the lighting setting to high. The hub performance preset looks pretty similar to the medium settings, but runs a little better and doesn't severely reduce texture detail options for those with enough VRAM. The built-in medium preset nerfs anisotropic filtering to 2 times and the texture settings to medium, which can make the game look a lot blurrier, especially in motion. We've kept those settings on the maximum, and you should only consider lowering texture quality if you don't have enough VRAM, such as on an 8GB GPU. While we've tried our best to improve Borderlands 4 performance through these settings, for people struggling with low FPS, I still don't think you can just lower settings in this game and call it well optimized. For one, it does nothing to solve Unreal Engine 5 traversal stutter, that's on the developer to fix, and there's also no setting that allows you to remove the 30 FPS cap in cutscenes, at least in the game menus. And at the end of the day, the game still runs relatively poorly despite our settings providing a better balance between visuals and FPS. On a GeForce RTX 5060 Ti 16GB using DLSS 4 quality upscaling at 1440p and the hub quality settings, I was typically getting between 60 and 70 FPS in open world gameplay. Definitely playable on a modern mainstream GPU, but hardly mind-blowing. This same GPU runs Cyberpunk 2077 on high settings at 1440p without upscaling at a higher frame rate. Alternatively, it can run a better looking game like Star Wars Outlaws at a similar frame rate using the Ultra preset with DLSS, and that's before we apply our graphics optimizations for that title. After analysing all the settings closely, it simply seems like Gearbox Software have gone all out implementing Unreal Engine 5 features with little to no consideration for how those features might scale to lower tier hardware. Borderlands 4 uses nanite, for example, yet nanite is designed to display high levels of detail, which isn't a good fit for the game's cel-shaded visual style. This just isn't a game that is going for realistic visuals, so was implementing that feature really necessary? There's also weird setting implementations. For example, you can completely disable all grass in the game if you want to, which makes it look very bad, but you can't adjust things like shadow draw distance or turn off grass shadows to improve performance. It seems work has been put in to handle lower texture settings reasonably well, but then some of the lighting settings are very punishing on the high settings for basically a placebo increase in visuals. Why isn't there a better balance between these sorts of things? I'm not a game developer, of course, so maybe there's a good reason why Borderlands 4 uses stuff like nanite and why some settings don't scale well, but they'd want to have a bloody good reason though, given the game runs like crap. Anyway, that's enough. Hopefully these optimized settings are useful and allow you to enjoy the game at a more reasonable balance between performance and visuals. I've played a bit of the game so far for this video, and it seems like it's pretty decent, which makes the poor performance even more disappointing. I just want to enjoy the game. I've loved Borderlands games in the past, one of my favorite game series. It just would be nice for us to get, I guess, at least one of these releases that doesn't run terribly at launch. The same thing was true for Borderlands 3 as well. So I don't know, maybe they can fix Borderlands 4. Anyway, that's it for this video. If you do appreciate all the work that we do here at Hardware Unboxed, all the testing of these latest games and GPUs, that sort of thing, then please consider supporting us via our Patreon page. Links to that is in the description below. If you sign up, you get access to some pretty cool benefits, Discord chat, monthly live streams, BTS content, plenty of good stuff. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.